What we're seeing today is what I call turnkey totalitarianism.
I'm sorry that I've been away for a while. I just wanted to update a few things that came up in the past few weeks regarding the Holocaust that viewers might find to be of interest. I should add, sort of parenthetically, that I was quite ill. But in any case, I feel a bit better now. Anyway, one of the things that has come up regarding that's significant to people that are interested in the Holocaust is the new Anne Frank book. It's called The Betrayal of Anne Frank, the cold case investigation. A cold case investigation by the Canadian scholar Rosemary Sullivan. The 60 Minutes piece by John Wortham was on January 16th, 2022, and it showed how a group of investigators and historians in Holland, and led by an FBI investigator, obviously from the United States, came together to try to determine who had betrayed the Franks to the Nazis. The 30-minute long investigative piece was interesting enough, and really anything about Anne Frank continues to fascinate, it seems like, everybody. But it was hardly a convincing piece. The FBI investigators and the many other law enforcement people, who I'm sure were very highly qualified, but they tried to solve a mystery of what had happened in 1944. But it's hard to get to the bottom of things when most of the people are in fact no longer alive. So the 60 Minutes piece was not very satisfying. It put forward a theory, but the theory, it wasn't devastating in the way that a Mike Wallace or Ed Bradley piece in the past had been. It was just another theory among many, perhaps of who turned the Frank family in. It may even be the strongest theory yet put forward, but it's not really that convincing. And I sort of watched it with kind of great incredulity. It was just like entirely circumstantial, at least to my sort of untrained eye. Of course, discussing a diary that's been in print for 75 years is always fascinating because each writer, Dr. Sullivan included, has their own take on what makes it unique, and they bring their own almost a personal connection in some way to them. From a thematic standpoint, however, it makes the story that she came up with, or the story that the investigators came up with, is that in the end it was not a rabid Nazi sympathizer who may have done in the family, but rather a Dutch Jew, Arnold van der Bergh, who was just trying to save his own family and his wife and children. It's thematically perfect, but perhaps one might say a little bit too perfect, because it offers a brilliant critique of Nazism itself as being so dangerous that it turns people against their friends and families. Anyway, the BBC and other news sites are now reporting that the book has been withdrawn by the publisher. There's also a statement from the publisher. It reads as follows: "We offer our sincere apologies to anyone who might be offended by this book." Usually 60 Minutes does better work than this, especially with regard to World War II. They're really good at that. And probably their apex was an Ed Bradley piece from 1998, where he busted Benjamin Wilkomirski, the author of Fragments, Memories of a Wartime Childhood. It's a 1995, I guess you'd call it was published as a memoir. But by 1998, it became pretty clear that it probably wasn't, that Wilkomirski had not been in Majdanek nor Auschwitz, and that he probably was never outside of Switzerland, at least during the war. He may have visited the camps later on as a tourist, perhaps, but not. Anyway, the Wilkomirski was basically not who he claimed to be. So that was the kind of standard that we were used to on 60 Minutes. Somehow, despite the fact that the publishers have decided to withdraw the book, the 60 Minutes, this story that I'm describing is still up on their website without any comment, like nothing sort of disclaiming it, despite the fact that the publishers are sort of not publishing the book anymore. The second controversial thing that came up, it's been a few interesting weeks for Holocaust studies, but the second issue was a controversial speech in which Robert F. Kennedy Jr., so the son of the assassinated senator from 1968, he appeared in a speech to compare the persecution of Jews in World War II to the government and others trying to make Americans take the third jab to try to control the COVID-19 pandemic. We all know that Kennedy Jr. is especially hostile to the notion of vaccination. But my concern here is that a public figure of his magnitude, who should definitely know better, is using hysterical, hyperbolic language to try to get support for a really rather dubious cause. But it's another advertisement for why we need Holocaust education. His attempt to show that the U.S. government is somehow not unlike the Nazis in obliterating dissent shows no understanding of the very war in which two of his uncles fought and one died. So it's a kind of a trivialization of World War II. It's the same, we see this before with Marjorie Taylor Greene, the congresswoman who compared the mask mandate in the United States Congress to the wearing of yellow stars by Jews and under the Nazis. People in positions of power, let's be honest, should know better, especially Kennedy, who had an elite education. His father would not be proud of this. These are most unwise comparisons generally. I mean, there's something to be learned from this, though. It seems like, well, I'll read you his quote. I mean, he said, even in Hitler's Germany, you could cross the Alps into Switzerland. You could hide in an attic like Anne Frank did. Today, the mechanisms are being put in place to make it that none of us can run and none of us can hide. It's a really unfortunate analogy, but it's one of those things where, every time you hear someone start with an analogy to the Holocaust, they're putting their foot in every cow pie in the pasture. It's just really bad form, and it's usually in horribly bad taste. Where maybe if they have to use the World War II, and maybe it would be better to sort of talk about the Nazi occupation and brutalization of Poland. I mean, it's just always they're just going right to 10 out of 10 by taking into the Holocaust as well, and Anne Frank in particular. I mean, it's just unfortunate to hear these kinds of things happening. We wish people would maybe try to rethink their comments before they. I mean, he's right about one thing. One of the things that Kennedy said, though, was, I mean, I couldn't help thinking about this, is that survival in Poland was so low that the notion of escape from Poland was the primary way people survived the war. If you did not get out of Poland, your chances as a Polish Jew of being killed was about 88%. But those that got out survived a lot better than anybody that tried to survive inside Poland, just by hiding. So maybe I'm trying to find something what Kennedy was saying that wasn't completely ridiculous. But of course, nothing guaranteed survival, not even escape, of course. But the idea was to get out of the Polish territory into Soviet territory or some other territory. But I may put in just a clip of that just for those who missed it. I can put in a few seconds of it.
They are putting in place all of these technological mechanisms for control. Even in Hitler's Germany, you could cross the Alps into Switzerland. You can hide in an attic like Anne Frank did.
The other thing that happened was that Whoopi Goldberg, this is it's really odd, but anyway, she said on the ABC program The View, she did not feel, this is really quite stunning, she did not feel that the Holocaust was about race. I'm sure she's a very nice lady, but the statement is just appallingly ignorant of the causes of the Holocaust. Since the horrific things that the Nazis did to the Jews of Europe, persecution, discrimination, and then total destruction, mass murder, was precisely because they felt Jews were an inferior race or a subspecies of humanity that had essentially forfeited the right to live. In point of fact, the September 1935 laws are called the Nuremberg Law for the protection of German blood and honor. In simple terms, the Nazis feared that their blood would become contaminated by Jewish blood, which would dilute their pure Aryan ancestry, or their superior Aryan race. So it really is all about race, at least in terms of how the Nazis saw it. And that's, of course, how the Nazis saw everything. And they justified all their actions of racial superiority by putting them into law. So you're actually violating the law. It's how Jews lost their citizenship and so forth. When these kinds of laws were often called racial hygiene laws. So yes, it was about race, yeah. was about right. This all came up though because the commentators on The View were discussing the banning. This is where it really gets. This was the weirdest one, so I saved it for last. The commentators on The View were discussing the banning of the famed graphic novel by the Tennessee School Board called Mouse. The book is called Mouse by Art Spiegelman. It's hard to describe how sad this is. It's just, since censorship in all its forms is just so incredibly ugly, and it diminishes everybody. But Spiegelman's book won a Pulitzer Prize in 1992. It's considered a brilliantly original work that recontextualizes the Holocaust by retelling the story with cats and mice as the antagonists and protagonists, respectively. There's something incredibly touching about reading it for the first time, but it's because it serves the purpose of really allowing you to think about it. I'd never really read this. I never really had read a book that caused me to really just sort of, oh yeah, like this is really, it was just sort of, it changed my thoughts on the topic. So it's a powerful work. And it's as unfamiliar, sort of, it's a familiar idea, but in an unfamiliar setting. It's sort of, it's an interesting, he's got an interesting mind to have come up with this. And of course, as graphic novels so often do, it crosses genres. So it's dealing with, it's sort of like memoir and sort of like history, but it's also got elements of fiction. And of course, it's also sort of art, like drawn art. So it's got a lot of different stuff going on. And so it's really, really terrific. I mean, even for people that know the history really well, there's something about seeing the tragedy of these horrific events portrayed as cats and mice that it takes you really back to your childhood and makes you rethink things. So it's truly a great book for kids who wanted to learn more about the Holocaust. So naturally they've banned it. To be good work and to good art oftentimes means that you're on the margins. You have to really push things, as Spiegelman did. It's typical. I mean, there's no other word for it. It's typical and it's sad. I'm left with that old quote, that people sort of despise what they don't understand. And banning books, it's a lot easier than writing books, And so it gets back even to the things that Kennedy was saying. That doesn't really get it. That's the part that always, the public figures don't always get it. You think they get it. You think they automatically get it, but they don't, So they're still making weird analogies to the Holocaust. That would be, if I was giving advice to any public figure, just stay away from the analogy. Just the human experience has many other analogies that would work. It's the same thing that did in that professor after 9/11. I think his name was Ward Churchill, he said the people that worked in the towers were little Eichmanns. I mean, they're just so tasteless and so not really understanding much about the Eichmann trial or who Eichmann was. You have to actually sort of be immersed in these things to understand them. Otherwise, you're just throwing around terms. But anyways, that was my update. I think I like the idea of sort of updating this every so often. So I hope that you'll tune in to see what the update is, and I guess all the rest. I mean, if you want to make some comments below, please do, and all the rest, liking and subscribing and all that. I know it sounds weird, but for Holocaust studies, but I don't mind discussing things with people. So it's anyway, I could use a few subscribers. But in any case, that's the update for this week, and I thank you for your time and thank you for listening.